You are, hopefully, you are watching or listening to Strangers in Space, and we are going to be spending the next 60 minutes talking about Series 3, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
Hi, I'm Matt.
And I'm Simon.
And I messed that up, didn't I? Because I was concentrating on the fact that the recorder didn't seem to want to start. Series 3, we've been here many, many times, but nevertheless, we're going to go here again. And why not, given that all the talk of David Tennant and Russell T Davies that we've been having lately, eh? I'll do some general, there are loads of general listener comments about Series 3 and a handful about the stories. I'll do the general ones in a minute. I've got to say, the 10 stories, I divided it into 10 for the purposes of the vote. 6 are below 50% and 4 are above 50%. 3 are above 70%, which kind of shows how this series fell in people's eyes. There are 3 or 4 stories that got a lot of love and everything else was kind of middling, sometimes middling at best, I suppose. Nothing came really, really badly out at the bottom, though. We'll get into that. Series 3, for me, this is the point at which David Tennant started to annoy me. So I think around about the time of the Dalek story, or very soon thereafter, I think his shtick started to get on my nerves a bit. I don't have the fondest memories of this series, but having said that, the point at which he starts to become a bit annoying is also the point at which the stories start to become really, really strong. So there's a balance there for sure. The bad things about this series, I think, are balanced out by the good things. I think it's a series where everybody who's working on it knows exactly what they're doing. And so even when it's not on, firing on all cylinders, I don't think it's terrible. We'll talk about the 2 or 3 stories that came bottom, and I've got praise for all of those stories. I don't think anything's bad. Having said that, I think there are some structural decisions that go with this series that kind of sit a bit weird. And I've talked about it before, so I'll just say it briefly and then we'll move on. Martha, she doesn't get the keys to the TARDIS until more than halfway through the series, which kind of means that she's probationary for more than half of the stories, which feels odd because it feels like she should be consolidating by the time you're a third of the way into the series, and yet she's still being tried out. The Doctor's still in love with Rose thing didn't sit badly with me at the time, because I think that's natural after you've told that story, but it kind of does go on. And while it eventually leads to Martha being given the agency to be able to turn around and say, no, I'm going to walk away from this, the fact that in the second half of the series, she barely spends any time with the Doctor, or at least on screen, she barely spends any time with the Doctor. There are something like 5 episodes in a row where they're either separated for almost the entire episode, or else they're just not on screen at all. It feels like there was a story that was going to be told, and somehow the decisions around which plots they were going to put in to tell that story have undermined the overall story that was taking place. So all the stories that they spend together, she's not actually a companion officially yet, and then he hands her a key and they don't spend any more time together at all. So structurally, I think it's a really weird series. But having said that, I think all the stories are strong, and my takeaway is I like most of it, even if some of it kind of flummoxes me. Matt, what's your takeaway on Series 3?
I'm quite a big fan of Series 3. I feel that this is where Russell T Davies actually got his eye in for me with the series. So maybe towards the end of Series 2, it demonstrated what power it could have, what emotional power it could have. Series 3, it feels like it builds. So the first half is sort of treading water a little bit, but then it suddenly gets kind of turbocharged in the second half, with maybe one exception, and really takes off. And the second half of Series 3 was when I started getting messages from people who hadn't been watching Doctor Who before, saying, actually, I can understand Doctor Who. I mean, literally halfway through this series, I got a message from somebody who had ridiculed Doctor Who for ages, who then had kids, and they just became hooked from this series until, I don't know, until the kids grew out of it, I suppose.
Yeah.
But this is the series. This is the series. I mean, there was a bit of this after the gas mask children, that you started seeing it suddenly everywhere that Halloween. But this series was the one where you started actually properly seeing it. It became an institution again.
Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah, because I think the sort of the episode Doomsday, kind of pushed it over the edge, and then from that point onwards was the point where everybody in the country was talking about this thing, that there were people who'd been catching up, but now suddenly everybody was watching together because everybody wanted to know what was going to happen next.
And that shifted my feeling towards it. So the first two series, really, I was watching thinking, I hope they don't screw it up, and I hope they just keep it safe and keep it popular. This series was where I realized this is going to carry on beyond this series for a long time. They can do interesting things now. They can start really pushing the boundaries of it, and you know, really they can fail with episodes, but they can sort of, you know, try and do interesting things. So this is when it becomes exciting for me, unpredictable.
How about you, Simon?
Yeah, much the same as Matt. It felt like it had dropped its shackles to an extent. It had used the Rose relationship to invest the audience to the point, you know, where they cared about the Doctor and they cared about the characters. But I kind of feel like it maybe should have got its pace up a bit quicker. That first half, as you say, Matt, doesn't. Maybe I'm talking about the Martha relationship. I'm not sure. It kind of feels like when it got to series 4 and we had Donna and things started being fun, if you could interchange those stories from series 4 with this one, and you've got a really strong season then. And kind of the whole Martha thing was like almost like a love hangover, without quoting a Diana Ross song. Which
did you just quote a Diana Ross song?
I did quote a Diana Ross song, a good one as well. And
you never know next. It'd be kind of a chain reaction going on.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah. I just it's just such a funny mix, because you're right, Matt. It did suddenly pick up, and it had that whole 2000 AD feeling at times, and it seemed to be, particularly in the second half, doing some brave stuff and doing some really good stuff and really meaty stuff with the stories. But at the same time, it got rid of the shackles of the Rose relationship, and it created all new ones by this weird puppy dog thing going on with Martha, which kind of held it down. But I'm sure we'll come to that in the discussion. So it was a weird mixture of being brilliant, but kind of a little tiresome as well.
The comments from our listeners, I'll try and whip through these because there are an absolute ton, but they obviously deserve reading out. Lawrence Hallett, and I'm trying to work out if that's an anagram of Matt Barber, but it doesn't appear to be. He says, this year felt like Doctor Who had actually arrived again. From the time I remember, the 80s mainly, of the show being my dirty secret, something you didn't own up to watching, it had become genuine water coolers show. People I worked with, extended family and friends that had never watched the show, suddenly became experts and fans. I would bathe in the glow of being able to employ my knowledge of classic Who to explain some of the plot points or expand on their appreciation of the stories. It was a time also of unparalleled exposure. As well as the main show, we had Sarah Jane, Torchwood, Totally Doctor Who Confidential. I was in Cornwall on holiday and went to the Doctor Who exhibition at Land's End, and also noticed the Dalek next to the famous Land's End mileage sign. Even the Blackpool Lights had a Doctor Who theme to them. It just felt great, he said. And by the way, have you read my book about the demons? Oh. Ian Martin says simply, I overwatched these at the time and can't really bear any of them now. My bad. Nice one, Ian. Steve Herr says, apart from the strange choices in the finale with the Dobby Doctor, Jesus Doctor, I don't think that's so terrible, actually. We'll come to it. The final 6 episodes of this season rocked. Paul Cornell's Human Nature is my pinnacle of new Doctor Who. David Kitchen, the run of 5 episodes from Human Nature to The Sound of Drums is, in my view, and everybody else's, David, I think, as good a run as any in the new series. Martha was my favourite new Who companion until Bill came along. Tennant here is in good form without being off the leash, as he is after this, and with names like Andrew Garfield, Derek Jacobi and Thomas Sangster, one of the most star-studded series of Doctor Who ever. Ian Charles, uneven series at its best. Human Nature and Blink are superb, but half are very meh. However, that moment in Utopia where the Master is revealed still gives me chills, a wonderfully memorable scene. Harry Whiteley, I think this was the season that made 11-year-old me stop watching New Who for a while. Loads of, ooh, I like that, but why have you just done that moments. Alistair Thwaite, a season with a respectable opening 3 episodes, then a run of 4 mediocre ones, followed by what may be one of the strongest runs of 5 episodes in the modern era, then a finale that's a bit silly. The 10th Doctor is a bit too mean to Martha. Also, why has a smart man like RTD completely forgotten how the UK electoral system works? I think that's kind of the point with fiction sometimes, though, eh? Adric Marks, and I've checked, and that is his real name. His parents christened him Adric. I haven't really checked. I understand why everyone loves Human Nature, but there is a small community of us that loves Doctor Who when it isn't being overly tropey or miserable, i.e. the Doctor not remembering who he is with the racism levelled at Martha and so on. And the Martha romance subplot is a total waste. But this season had so many fun and clever episodes that gave us more of what we wanted from the first 2 seasons, with some new stuff thrown in to surprise us. I think that's kind of your point as well, Matt, and I think I agree, basically. Phil Markham, a mixed bag of a season. Utopia is almost a perfect story from start to finish. A few years ago, Blink would have been first, but over various viewings, it's gone down in my estimation. And the worst Dalek story in all of New Who. I don't think it is. Avid W. Goon, a real mixed bag of a season. Human Nature through to The Sound of Drums has got to be one of the best runs ever, and then it falls off a cliff with Last of the Time Lords and the Dobby Doctor. Adrian Sturrock, I'm not sure what it is saying to note that the 2 best stories in this season by a country mile barely feature the 10th Doctor, but I'm sure it is saying something. Tim Allman, I was never a huge fan of Martha and initially found this series a bit insipid, but then it suddenly burst into life in the second half with perhaps the strongest run of episodes in all of New Who. James Courtney, one of RTD's better series as a whole. The story arc is allowed to develop a bit and not just be a repeating word. Unfortunately, it takes Martha until the middle of the series to become a proper companion, and that stunts any character growth for her. Obviously, that's my point. Luke Hammond, a game of 2 halves, but still one of my favourite series for that incredibly strong run of episodes from Human Nature, and it's actually quite difficult to rank the others, which all have a lot going for them. I can happily overlook the pretty dark turn at the end of The Family of Blood and the Jesus moment in Last of the Time Lords for the more subtly characterised and vulnerable portrayal of the 10th Doctor, whose smug factor is taken down a peg or 2 post-Rose. Bit of a shame that Martha's stint suffers through her unrequited love and the Doctor's cruel attitude towards her at times, but at least she emerges as a stronger individual, making her own positive decisions by the end. And finally, Gordon Rennie, and he's talking about Blink and Utopia here. He says, not a great season. It's a big drop-off between the top 2 and everything else. Speaking then of everything else, in 10th place, on 13.3%, Andy Massey says, overall a great season, but this was like when you look at the great curry you made, but all you can remember is when you rubbed your eye with the chili, made worse by the extended runtime. He votes this 10th, as does Alistair Thwaite, who says, why would absorbing a human make a Dalek a strong moral compass when the man in question was decidedly amoral? I'm going to answer that before we get on to the last comment, because I think when you absorb the human, you're absorbing what a human being is rather than necessarily how that human being has developed. So that human being wasn't born to be a bad person. And I think when you absorb him, you absorb the energy that's underneath the personality that's on top as well, if you know what I mean. Does that sound relatively sensible? I think what I'm saying is you absorb all of the DNA rather than just the stuff that you see.
Depends whether you believe in the criminal gene or not, doesn't it, really?
Well, exactly. And I don't believe in the criminal gene. I think nurture is as important as nature, and I think most things are a combination of factors.
I'd hope we didn't believe in the criminal gene. The criminal gene.
Well, exactly.
That gets us into eugenics territory, which.
Well, okay, if we're going to divert for a slight bit, I think it's inevitable that some stuff is passed on genetically, but I think obviously, nurture has to be the most important thing because we learn, right? We learn from the stuff that goes on around us. So that has to be the biggest deciding factor in the person we turn out to be, doesn't it? So whatever's passed on has to be sort of superseded by what comes afterwards. Anyway, David Kitchen says, and he votes this 8th. He says, I've come to enjoy the fun romp that is Daleks in Manhattan, but I'm afraid evolution of the Daleks goes a little too far and is terrible. Simon, what do you think of Daleks in Manhattan and evolution of the Daleks? Because I've been talking for so long with all those comments, I just want to stop.
I think it's a thing of two halves, or maybe 3 2/5 or something like that, because there's some really nice elements in the Hooverville side of things is really great. Hugh Quashie putting in a good turn. Obviously we've got Andrew Garfield as well, and there are certain elements that are really nice, and in essence things like the Daleks using parts of themselves to create transmitters, and that's all great. But there's just something about it that makes it quite light and theatrical and just doesn't seem to work, and gets a bit silly. I mean, people go on about the Dobby Doctor. I think the Human Dalek, unfortunately, one of these things that probably looks quite good on paper, and Russell T Davies probably thought would go down well with a new audience. Maybe it did. I don't know. I don't know how many people are proud of their Human Dalek masks that they got from Woolworths, but it just doesn't sit very well, and just doesn't sit very well in the memory, I don't think, because it just it just doesn't seem to work on all the ways that it's meant to, and that's where I am with it, really.
Matt?
I quite like it. I think light and theatrical is one of the things that sort of sets it apart from some of the other stories of this series. I think my problem with the Dalek human hybrid isn't the design. I quite like the design. I think it's the script in the cliffhanger. There's a really clunky line of dialogue, which I can't quite remember, but it just resulted in, instead of a gasp at the end of the cliffhanger, it's resulted in a, well, we can see that you didn't have to tell us who you are or what you are. You're stepping out of a Dalek and you've got a face like a Dalek. So yeah, I'm trying to think what is the worst new series Dalek story.
Oh, I couldn't say, but I'm sort of in between. I think I quite like the idea of this, and I quite like a lot of what goes in it. But I completely agree with Simon; it doesn't quite work. But I totally agree with you, Matt, that the human Dalek, that for me is fine. And I think if anybody's got a problem with that, you've only got to look at that bit in Revelation of the Daleks, where the girl, the one who's looking for her father, finds him inside a glass Dalek, and he's still basically human, but he's also Dalek. And I think, well, you look at this, it's not really that different. It's the other way around, but it's really the same sort of thing. And I think sometimes Doctor Who just needs to be a bit mad. Simon, if this makes it any better for you, the human Dalek is Series 3's equivalent of a frog on a chair. Does that help?
Well, I quite like the body horror kind of thing. That whole bit where the guy's submerged into the Dalek and absorbed by it is pretty. It's pretty horrible. So I kind of quite like that, and I kind of didn't like that kind of way, if that makes sense.
But I think it's such a mad idea that I love the idea, and I don't find the execution of it terrible. But I just think I think the direction of the 2 episodes perhaps doesn't quite sit too well with the script. You know how I'm always saying about series 11, the scripts are doing one thing and the directors are doing something else, the production's doing something else. I think Daleks in Manhattan's kind of got the same problem. It's set in a theatre, it wants to be really theatrical, but I think the direction is perhaps taking some of it too seriously and can't marry the theatrical stuff with the Hooverville stuff.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Next.
On 16.7% in ninth place, Andy Massey, who votes at ninth, says, please God, no more Gatiss when RTD comes back. I think Mark Gatiss is quite good in this. I think this is basically a good episode. I think it's kind of slightly unbalanced by the way they've squeezed it into the 45 minutes. So I don't think any of the elements of it quite seem to get enough space to breathe and develop. But I quite like it, and I love the way it sort of goes off to the church for the big theatrical ending again. The monster, I think, is terrific running around. I don't really have any problems with this, and I certainly don't have any problems with Mark Gatiss. Usually I find his acting troublesome, but I think he's actually pretty good in this. Matt, Lazarus Experiment.
Yeah, thinking back, I quite like this. I think I can see why they're voted quite low. But this one's clearly has a style that it's aiming for, which is kind of comic strip pulp fiction 1950s alien body horror, and I think it meets it. I can't remember being humiliated by the CGI monster when I watched it originally, because again it had that kind of nostalgic look feel to it, and I like the ending anything in a big cathedral. I think they filmed it in Wells, didn't they? Set in Southwark.
I think so, yeah.
So anything that ends up in one of these sort of these cathedral spaces, it's always going to be a good balance to like the technology at the beginning. So it's quite a well balanced episode, I think.
Yeah, I certainly found it absolutely all right. Simon.
Yeah, I think you're right. Just because it's not one of the kind of linchpin, landmark episodes within this season where you suddenly learn something really. I mean, as it is, you do learn something. The breadcrumbs are laid down, aren't they, with the idea that the master's behind all of this and is financing the work, about the aging thing. But yeah, you shouldn't put this down really, because it's a treading water episode. It's of a standard, and as you say, Mark Gatiss is pretty good in it. And I don't think anything falls down. The only thing with the monster is we were, I think, at a stage with the CGI where we were starting to see some pretty incredible stuff on the big screen, and this is where you had some disparity between cinema standard CGI and TV CGI. Because when you saw the creature up close, although it had that horrible thing going on with the mouth, you still had a still rendered human face stretched across a polygon, basically at the top, so it didn't really convince you because the eyes weren't doing anything. There was no life in the eyes, and that's and you can't have a go at it for that, because this is still pretty early days in Doctor Who.
It's what we call the Luke Skywalker effect.
Not anymore.
Well, I'm not there yet, so don't spoil it for me. Yeah, I don't think it's possible to avoid that, but we shan't say out loud what we're talking about just in case anybody has.
Oh, okay.
And one other thing in that episode's favour, Gugu and Barbara Raw, yes, she's amazing. It's a shame she didn't get to come back beyond series 3, but she's gone on to much bigger and better things now, right?
Yeah, really great. Yeah,
but she was perfect.
Sorry, pardon?
No, I don't know if that's true, Simon, but
okay, all right.
In 8th place, on 27%, Gordon Rennie says, he votes this 7th, he says Chibnall by numbers, literally, which I don't think is true, actually. It's an obvious joke to make. I don't think it's true, because I don't think this is much like any of the Chibnall episodes that follow. And apparently this was written a bit in a hurry. I don't know if this is true, but I'd heard, I'm sure it says on Wikipedia, or I've heard somewhere, or somebody said that this was written in like a fortnight because it was there to replace something that fell through or something. So this was like a real last minute sort of deal, apparently. And Chris Chibnall's the man who could do that. And I think actually 42 I think it really holds up. We watched it. Do you remember when he was announced? We rewatched it, and I think we all gave it like 8 out of 10 because we all found it to be a lot better than we'd remembered it being. So yeah, I think, if this is down in the bottom three and sort of the weaker end of the series, like I say, I think the stories in series 3 are all pretty strong. It's just some of the structure that I don't like. But yeah, 42 for me is fine.
We're at Lazarus Experiment levels of treading water type story. I think going back to the time, I think we said this in the previous episode, although I think it was a blue box, that the promise of the real time thing, the 42-minute thing, we thought was going to have a far greater presence, much more like the TV program, and it didn't. So therefore, it didn't kind of come across as anything as experimental as we were hoping. So it's that thing of expectation again. I think the weakest thing in it is Michelle Collins, but then that's my. People are going to think I've got it in for certain female actors, but it's one of those, isn't it? If you don't see it, you don't see it.
Yes.
But then you're having to go at David Tennant for the whole series, aren't you, JR? So all in all,
I'll keep it up.
Yeah.
Matt, 42.
I mean, I think female actors are great, and I really like them. So I defend them. I don't know what Simon's talking about, but I definitely defend female actors in general.
Hang on, both Simon and us in general, we're talking about how great Gugu and Bata Raw was, right? Just a couple of minutes ago.
Yeah.
It's not about the gender; it's about the person.
No, it's absolutely not about the gender, but I would still defend them. I think it's one of Chibnall's stronger stories from the new series from his pre-showrunner time. I think it did feel like treading water, not just where it is placed in the series, but the actual story itself, because it has that pub quiz in the middle. So there's a clear kind of A to B to C structure to it. There's a clear kind of plug and play sort of monster with a catchphrase in it, which they were doing quite a lot at this time.
Yeah.
But they both work. I mean, it was a good setting. It's claustrophobic.
Like I say, it's like somebody said to him, write me an RTD episode in a hurry, and he wrote an RTD episode in a hurry.
Yeah, and that's fine. It also, this was the one where, so this series was split into two because there was a 2-week break, which at the time felt like a massive hiatus for Doctor Who, whereas now obviously a 2-week break, we dream of 2-week breaks, but between Lazarus Experiment and 42 there was time off for good behaviour, for the Eurovision Song Contest or something, or football, and so there was that trailer at the end of the Lazarus Experiment giving us sort of what was going on in the second half. So it felt, even though it was only 2 weeks, it felt like 42 was the start of a new series of Doctor Who that had lots of things to potentially look forward to, because I knew what human nature was going to be because I'd read the book. I was looking forward to John Sims because I like John Sims. So there was all this sort of stuff to look forward to. And I think somebody in the magazine had described how scary Blink was in advance of it. So 42 was a sort of a new launch pad.
42 kind of occupies the same dramatic space as a Satan pit as well, doesn't it? So who knows, maybe a 2-episode version of it would have had that bit more suspense, where it builds up to things a bit more. But
it kind of suffers from the same problem as the Lazarus Experiment in that certain story things don't get much chance to develop, do they? Which is where I think RTD and Stephen Moffat differ. I think RTD tries to do a whole plot in 45 minutes, where Stephen Moffat comes up with a short story and expands it. So I think neither of them really fills the 45 minutes quite contentedly, but they've come at it from vastly different angles. And I prefer the Moffat approach. But if you're looking at RTD in terms of how those episodes work, then you can't complain about the way this or the Lazarus Experiment fill the 45 minutes, because all the episodes back then pretty much were doing that. And I think this does it as well as any of the others. Anyway, speaking of one of the others, in 7th place on 45.2%, right, you're going to get it from this. This is one for you, Matt. Andy Massey votes this one 8th and says, hey, nonny, no, thanks.
Oh. Do you want me to comment on it? I quite like the I quite like the Shakespeare Code. I think it's witty. I think it is actually the Shakespeare Code and Gridlock balance each other out quite well, because Gridlock has wit to it, but it is quite poignant and somber, but also colourful. Shakespeare Code is just this mad kind of melting pot of Shakespeare puns and really nice location filming in the Globe. So it kind of stretches. If you're going to have Doctor Who meets Shakespeare, it kind of stretches that concept to the limit, and it throws in everything you'd want, I think. So, and I quite like Gareth Roberts, with the exception of The Caretaker, which I wasn't a big fan of. I think I like all of Gareth Roberts' stories. I think they've all got. I like the humour in them. I like the kind of irreverence. I like the kind of parochialness of them, the sort of down to earth quality of them.
I think they work really well as long as you don't dig too deep into the sort of psyche of them. And this reposits Shakespeare as this sort of rock star type character, which I don't think passes too much scrutiny, but then who cares when the episode's a lot of fun. And I think this sidesteps questions of race and that sort of stuff. And I think it's slightly problematic that at the end it sort of ends on a note of Harry Potter, which for me is kind of, if you're going to evoke Shakespeare, then at least end on a note of Shakespeare, right? But it kind of ends on a magic spell out of Harry Potter instead, which, although that kind of alludes to Shakespeare in the doing of the magic spell, it didn't feel right that it ended on a magic spell like that. It felt like it should have done something a bit more Shakespeare at the end. But then I don't mind, because immediately after that you've got the joke about Elizabeth I, so it picks itself back up again, right?
I think puncturing pomposity is the key to his approach. So using Harry Potter and not Shakespeare as the solution to the whole thing is in keeping with the story. However, it is out of kilter, but that is in keeping.
It is, but I felt it was a shame myself. But I don't dislike the Shakespeare Code at all. I think it sits alongside a lot of those other, all of these episodes have got great moments, and all of them have got irritating moments. The bit where his heart stops and he has to restart his heart is an irritating moment from David Tennant. But, I'm not going to hate the episode because of one irritating moment. Simon, how do you feel about this?
There are great women actors in this as well.
Oh, yeah, very much so.
I'm just about to say how much I hated the witches, but anyway. But that's not their fault. The performances are great. It just felt, I don't know, witches in Doctor Who. The witch hunters does it better, but Dean Lennox Kelly's great. I actually think Martha works really well in that, and I love the way Will Shakespeare is taken with her, and that works really well. So I haven't really got a problem with it. I'm just kind of indifferent to the villain, really, kind of indifferent to it, because it's another alien purporting to be something, it's something else from the past, which oh no, they weren't actually witches, they were aliens type thing.
Yeah, that's getting to be a habit with RTD at the start of this series, isn't it?
Yeah. So I haven't really got a problem with it. Again, it's treading water. I mean, I'm usually a defender of. Is this the second one in the series?
Yeah.
It was, yeah. I usually defend the second ones in the series because they tend to get a harsh time from the fans. But yeah, it's all right.
In sixth place on 46.7%. Also, it's all right. Lawrence Hallett says a great introduction to an underrated companion. He votes it fourth. Simon, Smith and Jones.
Yeah, it's kind of the generic RTD first story of the season. That's how it is. It's how it sits in my brain.
Jadoon on the Moon, Simon.
Jadoon on the Moon, yeah, that was pretty good. I really enjoy. I remember at the time David Tennant, really enjoying David Tennant's turn on it. Martha seemed to show loads of promise as a character. She She was already her own. This is the thing, actually. From the start, she was very much her own person and showed lots of gumph, and she was a well-rounded person in her own right. And then suddenly, she's not enough on her own. And I think
she goes from being the character in this story who's pretty much solves it by herself by the end of it. To be, to 4 episodes later, she's like, "Oh, please give me a key. Oh, please love me." And it's like, what happened to this character? She arrives fully formed, and then she gets taken to pieces across the course of the next few episodes before being stuck back together again by the end of the series. Yeah, but I think that's a structural problem and it's certainly not a problem with this episode. This is terrific for that.
Yeah, and the Jaduna are a great invention. And and it's got a logic about it. Although it's obviously a whole building being sent to the moon, but then why not? We've seen far stranger stuff. It's very Three Doctors, isn't it? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, again, it was a lot of fun. That's how I remember it. It was a lot of fun watching it with the family. So yeah, it's all good.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. The Jadoon on the moon stuff, I thoroughly enjoyed. Matt?
Not a fan of opening episodes because they have a tendency to sort of play it safe rather than they never seem to start the whole thing off with a bang. They start it with a kind of a slow build up. I've got used to that now because I can see the point of doing that, and I can see that that's just what certainly Russell T Davies tended to do.
I think though, just coming on that point, I think this is the one that does that best out of all of them, though.
So I think this is probably the one that does that best out of all of them, though, because I quite like Jadoon on the moon. I think the concept is strong. So the sort of visual. I think that probably the weak bit for me is the Plasmavore. Yeah. And the sort of the story around that. So that she's supposed to be the central villain, and it kind of she's not quite strongly portrayed enough to be the central villain. I only realised she was the central villain at the end. When she was revealed as it. This is one with the slabs as well, isn't it?
Yes.
As well as the Jadoon.
Yeah. Which is I thought they were a really good invention. I thought
they were good. The cheapest and campest invention Doctor Who's ever done. These sort of leather clad, but it's an invention that entirely sells it for me by its name, calling them slabs.
They're not 1,000 miles away from. They're not 1,000 miles away from Shade in the Tides of Time in the comic strip, really. Give them a sort of black globe for a head instead of the helmets, and they're sort of getting there. I think that's the influence.
But call them slabs.
Yeah.
It has that kind of, they have no sort of animus. They're just pieces of meat that are sort of programmed to do one particular thing.
Absolutely.
Next.
All right, on 48%, so just slightly above it. James Courtney, sound is great, last not so much. He votes it 7th. I think Sound of Drums for Doctor Who, because obviously this is Doctor Who, so everything you do in Doctor Who has to be filtered through the way the series works. So it's daft instead of leaning into the mystery and leaning into the conspiracy. It's daft and silly, and it's paper thin, to be honest. But the conspiracy thriller stuff in The Sound of Drums, I think, works really well in Doctor Who and then The Last of the Time Lords, I think, is mostly good. I think the stuff with Martha wandering the planet is mostly good. I wish we could have spent a bit more time and seen a bit more of what she does. I think the stuff with the name's got out of my head. The sort of globe things, human beings. Toclophane, that's the word I was looking for. I think the stuff with them is mostly also really good. I think the Dobby Doctor stuff, far from having a problem with it, I think that stuff's hilarious, and why not? And yeah, people say you should have the hero in your last episode. It should be the strong moment. No, for once, we've seen what David Tennant's like in a last episode the year before. We don't need to see that this time. And we get to see it again the following year too, so we don't need to see it here. It's good that Martha gets a lot of stuff to do. I think of all the 4 Russell T Davies, 5 if you include the End of Time finales, I think this one makes the most logical sense, in that the thing that's used to defeat the Master is the thing that he uses himself to subdue the human race in the first place. So he uses this sort of mind paralysis field, this sort of psychic field to subdue the human race, and they turn that against him. Brilliant idea. The Doctor coming up in a Jesus pose, very silly, but that's a few seconds in the episode. It doesn't really spoil it for me. I think The Last of the Time Lords is underrated. It's not one of the best episodes ever, but I think it's absolutely fine. And of the 5, let's say, Russell T Davies finales, it's the one I like the least, but at the same time, it's the one I think is probably objectively in many ways the best, because it doesn't rely on the people watching it just wanting it to be emotionally satisfying, but actually is in some ways plot satisfying too, in a way that the others aren't. So I don't know, I don't think this is great, but I don't think it's terrible. Matt?
I think on watching it, I think I would have agreed that Sound of Drums is much better than Last of the Time Lords, and it kind of went downhill with Last of the Time Lords. I think part of that is at the time I wasn't used to this kind of time jump in between cliffhanger and the next episode. Now that Stephen Moffat's done that with almost all of his two-parters, it seems, he sort of has these time jumps. I'm kind of more comfortable with that. So I can look at Last of the Time Lords slightly more objectively. I think Sound of Drums, I agree. I really liked the kind of parallax view conspiracy thriller stuff in it, because you can see exactly what they're doing right from the start. There was a comment that Russell T Davies doesn't seem to understand elections, which I kind of sympathise with, having watched years and years, which I think is overrated and ridiculous. Last of the Time Lords, yeah, I like the Talk of Fame. John Sim, singular, is really good. I think he's just the wrong side of madness, so he does tip over the edge and goes too far. But I think that's fine, because at least it's memorable, and at least there are a couple of scenes where I think he's just going too far, but that they're more than compensated by the scenes where he absolutely nails the madness.
Yeah.
So yeah, I have happy memories of this.
Do you know, you just reminded me of something. Mark Cockram will remember this. We were going to the pub on Sunday nights at this point, me and a few friends, Mark being one of them. And I remember we got to the pub after the Sound of Drums, and everyone said, wow, what's going to happen now? And I said, well, the next episode will start with a caption that says 6 months later, and we'll pick it up further down the road. And sure enough, well, it was 12 months later. But yeah, sure enough, we all came back in the week after, and everyone, well, swore at me for spoiling the start of the episode for them. Matt, Simon, what did you think of the finale?
I loved it at the start, first time round. The Dobby Doctor, or the aging Doctor, it hit me at an emotional level, and the work was done to make me emotionally attached to this Doctor and care about him. And to see that happen to the Doctor, it was the same effect as Han Solo in Carbonite, or being tortured, that you hate seeing your heroes go through and being diminished like that.
Yeah,
so for
that
me,
was the point of having it in, wasn't it?
It disturbed me, as opposed to, I didn't think it was silly at all. I just thought it was all a bit strange, and it was a reminder that the Doctor isn't human. So I didn't really have a problem with it, and effects wise, I didn't have a problem with it. It was strange more than silly in my head. The whole
and coming at the end of the season where we'd had the human Dalek, it felt like a natural progression as well, I think.
Oh yeah, possibly. Maybe it desensitized us to. I don't know. The Martha thing made really good sense character-wise. That was her finding a way. But as we just said in that first story, she's already kind of proved herself as being this rounded individual. So she could only improve from there. But it's almost like she had to be knocked down first and then find her way back again. So I like the idea of the Martha doing the tour of the earth and all that sort of thing. But as to whether I think Friedrich Agyeman delivered that in a way that wasn't kind of unbelievable and a bit 1960s.
I think it's because what they made the character go through across the
Yeah,
course of the
possibly.
season. It's like every week she was being asked to be a different person.
Yeah.
So the character she plays in Human Nature is so different from the one she plays in the finale. It doesn't feel believable in terms of development. So I think she's struggling with that.
She also misses an episode where it's just her, because Billie Piper didn't need that, because really the Billie Piper years were about Billie Piper and about Rose. Rose was central.
The very first episode was really a Billie Piper centric one,
and Martha got her turn left, which was sort of, or Catherine Tate got turn left, which was very centered around Catherine Tate. Martha never really had that.
She gets, isn't it?
Yeah, and it doesn't really focus on her, so it talks about how much she does, but it doesn't really. It sort of shows snippets of it. The closest I think she gets is the Human Nature one.
She's great in Human Nature.
She is, and I think that's as close as she gets to a story that focuses on her. But the problem is, it focuses on David Tennant giving a whole different performance. So there's a distraction from what she's doing.
Yeah, he's the one who draws your attention for sure. Anyway, let's get into the top 4. These are the ones that got a lot more love, especially the top 3, but this one too. And there will be surprises here. In 4th place, though, on 58.9%, and Lawrence Hallett, he votes this 7th, but he says a fun story. He says, I remember getting goosebumps when the Doctor sat opposite Martha and started describing Gallifrey. This is Gridlock. I think this is an absolute racket of an episode, like something out of 2000 AD, but riven through with that weirdly Russell T Davies sense of humour that was now becoming sort of, associated with Doctor Who so deeply. Yeah, it's mad. It's mad, but it's mad in the best possible way, I think. And I don't know if it really has anything. Well, it has things to say, but I don't know if it really ends up saying them. It seems like it starts to allude to saying lots of things, but it never really follows through. So at the start, it's a bit about drugs, never really follows through on that. And by the end of the episode, when you get to the face of Bo dying upstairs just because of old age, and because the whole point of the situation they're in has not been set up by a villain. I mean, he brought the Macra in and had them not set it up. And he did say afterwards the reason he did that is because he didn't want this story to have a villain. But I think that's the one thing that sort of undermines this episode, is that when you get to the end and there wasn't a villain, it feels like all the things that the episode could have been saying, they're kind of fudged a bit. So the drugs thing, the people in the situation, and the politics of that and the religion of that, it feels like he has all these strings and he doesn't really pull on any of them. But I don't think that spoils an episode that's terrific fun. Simon.
Yeah, I think everything you've said, and while it doesn't really touch down on anything in particular, it does something interesting, and it takes us to another place for a while and makes us think about our own journey as in the human race, as current affairs, as current things that are going on are happening, that we are a ridiculous species. And I think it illustrates that, but it illustrates it in a lovely kind of TV hitchhikers, as you say, 2000 AD kind of way. Loved seeing Face of Bo at the end. Absolutely loved it. Felt kind of tagged on, but it kind of worked with having the nurses there and what have you. But again, it was a lot of fun. This is the thing with this series. It was a lot of fun at the time. It just doesn't. Sometimes these things don't take much examination, do they? They don't. They don't weather it so well.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of fun.
I think that's it about Series 3. I think it's so much fun and a lot of really good stories. But again, I go back to what I said about the structural thing. I think the overall thing kind of tarnishes it a bit in the memory, but I don't think that's really fair on the stories. Anyway, Matt.
I mean, slightly overrated now. I think it's sort of, for some reason, it's become so celebrated, and I'm trying to decide if I agree with that or not. Half of me thinks it's because it has Abide With Me sequence, which feels like the most Russell T Davies thing in maybe in his first 3 years. That kind of sudden pivot to kind of poignancy. But actually thinking about it, having been in lockdown off and on for 2 years, the idea of this kind of attempt at benevolence of creating this kind of circular motorway to keep people on, to help them avoid a virus, and they just keep going round and round, that kind of makes more sense now that we've been in lockdowns, and there are probably lockdowns to come at some point in the event of new and more dangerous viruses. So it's kind of has that extra edge now, which it didn't have before.
The whole thing is ripped off of Paul Thomas Anderson doing Wise Up in Magnolia anyway, I think. I mean, it seems pretty obvious to me. Do you remember that bit? We'll probably get around to that on Film Club at some point.
Okay.
But anyway,
the bit where they all start singing?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That was the Abide With Me moment, not the virus moment.
Yes, I'm going back to what you started.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry, I had to retune my brain. So I thought it was fine. When I last watched it, I was actually more struck by it. When I first watched it, I thought this is a bit like New Earth, sort of treading water. I didn't quite see where it was going, and it felt because it's all sort of CGI, a lot of CGI, it felt strangely claustrophobic. I didn't quite realize the scale of the traffic jam. You could just see, and I think because I watched what was the making of Doctor Who, Totally Doctor Who, or
Confidential,
Doctor Who Confidential, I watched that, and you could see them filming David Tennant dropping from the car into an identical car, just redressed, and they showed it being redressed, and it showed how they did it, and that kind of ruined obviously that was how they did it, but it sort of ruined the illusion of it, and so it became a bit like, almost ironically, the cheap episode, even though it had like invention and scale.
In third place, on 72.2%, Gordon Rennie votes this one second and says, what happens when you cast a venerable old heavyweight actor and he walks away with the episode in his pocket? Despite Jacob's Yana performance pulling in everything in the episode's gravity well, John Sims' young and dynamic master still grabs your attention. This is a story of two halves, in a way, because the first half about the I can't even remember, the future kind. Yeah, the future kind on the last planet. That stuff is a bit kind of not sure. And if that didn't go anywhere, then this episode would have been one of the weaker ones of the series. But as it is, when it starts picking up, it makes it worth having sat through that stuff in order to be able to facilitate what happens in the second half. And this is Russell T Davies, and we've seen it in all the other things he's done since, and we saw it in a few things that he did before too. When Russell T Davies gets threads and works out how to pull those threads together, then he can really set the screen on fire. And the second half of Utopia is one of the very best examples of Russell T Davies suddenly realizing what to do with the threads. I don't think he necessarily always plans it. It certainly doesn't feel like he necessarily always plans it. And the writer's tale gives you the impression that he certainly doesn't always plan it. But when it works, it really works. And it really, really works in this. So, Matt.
Yeah, I'd agree, except I don't think it's two halves. I think I agree that it starts and you start thinking, actually, this is like an early Sylvester McCoy story, or actually it's like Gridlock or New Earth. It's sort of, this is going to be one of those sort of isolated, treading water, run-of-the-mill sci-fi stories. But very quickly, I think they start seeding in little weirdnesses, mysteries. Yeah. And then the fob watch, and it doesn't take long for you to start thinking, well, something else is going on, and then it accelerates from there. And I think it wouldn't have that impact if it didn't start. And in fact, I don't think it would have that impact if there hadn't been other treading water episodes this season, because we've kind of been lulled into a sense that every so often there's going to be a story that just treads water, because we've already said it about 3 or 4 of the stories that preceded this. And this feels like that, but then it absolutely doesn't. And I think it needed to feel like that at the beginning.
Oh, yes. And I tell you what, in particular, it very much feels like 42, And I think that's part of the effect, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't just feel like it's treading water, but it feels like it's treading water in the same way as an episode that you'd had just 4 weeks earlier, I think.
I mean, and also it starts in a quarry, which is about as generic as you can get in the Doctor Who stories. So the first thing you see is time in the Rani, basically. And you're just thinking, has Russell T Davies written the most generic, dull? Has he written Doctor's Daughter a year earlier, a year early? And then, but it's not long before you start to realize actually that's not, Utopia isn't about Future Kind. It's not about the quarry. It's about what weird stuff is happening with Derek Jacobi, and that's where all your attention sort of refocuses.
Simon.
It's just really great. From Captain Jack hanging onto the side of the TARDIS onwards, it's just Future Kind was probably the most visually disappointing thing. Although it makes a lot of sense that the humans will eventually evolve into growing teeth that look like the little pegs they leave before they put your veneers on. So
in Orphan
the Future Kind. Was that
in Orphan 55?
Yeah.
That's just the working class.
Oh, is it? Okay. Yeah, but essentially they look like humans when their veneers have fallen off. You know, those little pegs that they leave to attach them. But other than that, it's just really well paced, because the biggest compliment I can pay it is it feels like it's finished before the pace is just really, really good. It's kind of finished before you're ready. So you realise what a good time you've had watching it. Chippo Chung's brilliant as Chantho. That was a really good invention. See how I pulled that one back?
Yeah, well done.
No, it's just all really good. And the reveal of the Master was just wonderful and dead exciting as a long-term and a new fan, I would imagine.
There had been a little bit of talk beforehand. This was before I really was very much on the internet, and there had been some talk that the Master was going to appear in this episode and Derek Jacobi was going to be playing him. And I remember starting this episode thinking that's not true. You know, clearly that's not the case. And then when you got to the fob watch bit, even though I'd sort of heard, I'm sure I'd heard that that's where it was going, that was so much the sort of heart throbbing, oh my god, it really is doing it, and look at how it's doing it, and look at the twist when you see the fob watch, just worked so well. And it goes on, and the episode after this is the sort of parallax view one, but I think you get a lot of the parallax views kind of in the second half of parallax view. You get this whole sort of sense of, oh my god, is that what it's about? Oh my god, is that what's happening? Oh my god, is that where this has been going? And you get that here in Utopia, which I think is a really good way of setting the Sound of Drums up.
And the fob watch was extraordinary because human nature, because it was based on a book, always had this appearance of being just a one-off. It was going to be a kind of an isolated, enclosed story, one concept that wasn't going to come back. And yet 2 episodes later, he brings it back because it's such a good concept as a way of explaining the Master. That was, but I think I was spoiled for the Master in this, because it must have been the internet. I must have been on the internet around this time, and I just heard rumors. So I knew that I guessed, I assumed that Derek Jacobi and John Sim were coming in this, but it's the nature of his return and the idea that it's somehow he's been hidden to himself. And that's expanded into a whole new sort of set of stories in Doctor Who. It keeps coming back for a good reason.
Right. In second place, on 84.1%, Andy Massey votes this first. And he says, still not totally understanding how they feed on the potential energy of the people sent back through time. But hey, who cares? In second place, it's Blink. And you know what that means, people? That means that when we do our poll of all the winners at the end of this, in order to celebrate our 10th anniversary with the list of our listeners' favourite Doctor Who stories, Blink is not going to be among the reckoning. I don't know what to say about that. So, Simon, tell me what you think of Blink.
I think that is kind of unfair, because I think that it has become diluted because we are now used to stories with the Weeping Angels in. When it was on its own as the only Weeping Angels story, it stood out as a unique episode, as something in its own right, and possibly the the reveal of more powers and the fact that there's more to them has kind of knocked them down, not the story down slightly in viewers' reckoning. So, but I still think it's absolutely great. I think it's pretty much another perfect episode from Stephen Moffat. I can't actually fault it at all. And I adore the moment where you see the Doctor at the end in the bows, and that they're in the middle of another adventure, because I don't think that's ever something that's been done to that extent before. I mean, you get little things where you have conversations where they say, "Oh, we've been to this planet where there's flying sofas and things like that," but you've never actually seen a little window into another adventure that we'll never see on television. So it's just really, really great.
I think it's one of the top 5 best episodes of Doctor Who ever made. The bit about the rain, it's the same rain. That is just an astonishing piece of writing. Something that you would never have expected to hear in Doctor Who. Something that moving, that one line of dialogue makes me cry every time. I just think this is an astonishing episode of Doctor Who, and I can't believe it's not going to be in our poll of the winners.
Sally Sparrow. How can you? Yeah.
None of which is to diminish the story that wins, because I think they should have maybe drawn, frankly. I think the one thing about this, as well as all the stuff that you've said, Simon, is that it doesn't really feature an awful lot of the Doctor. So maybe it doesn't quite feel like a Doctor Who story. And so maybe it shouldn't win because it's not quite a Doctor Who story.
But he's present. He's manipulating,
and it's in
the whole
series.
Story. Yeah.
And the truth is, if this isn't quite a Doctor Who story, then Human Nature isn't quite a Doctor Who story either, for the same reasons, I suppose. Anyway, Matt, Blink.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's. I mean, at one stage, it was classed as the best Doctor Who story ever.
Yeah,
and I think it's less the number of Weeping Angel stories we've had since then. It's the number of Stephen Moffat stories we've had since then, because that kind of back and forth in time. I think it's the number of Stephen Moffat stories we've had, and the scarcity of Paul Cornell stories.
Yes.
So Paul Cornell stops here with Human Nature, Family of Blood, and he ends, albeit rewritten presumably by Russell T Davies, although he lives quite close to me, so I shouldn't shout that too loudly. But he ends with that great story. Stephen Moffat, this is his sort of launch pad, really, into his style of Doctor Who, and I think we've all become a little bit sort of immune to it. But I think this does deserve to be number 1, because I do think this is, as you say, top 10 ever Doctor Who. I think this is a great Doctor Who story. I think this is, in particular, one of the best things on television that year.
Yeah.
And weird that it was shown on a Saturday night. And this is another sort of milestone, I think, in the solidifying of Doctor Who as an institution at that time on a Saturday, but also Stephen Moffat's career. I think this is where it really kind of solidified again as his way of writing drama rather than comedy. I think, or mixing drama and comedy.
At the same time, Jekyll, I think, must have been showing pretty much about the same time as Blink, and I think that's the first time Stephen Moffat's done, I would say, straight drama. It's not quite straight drama, but Jekyll and Blink do in some ways go hand in hand, as they're both pieces of television fiction that sort of look at what television fiction is and how it works, and try to sort of take it apart and put it back together in a slightly different way. And I think Jekyll didn't quite succeed, because I don't think audiences were ready for that across 6 episodes that weren't defined by being part of something like Doctor Who, whereas Blink does, because it's defined by being Doctor Who, and yet it sits itself so far apart from the rest of Doctor Who that it just feels completely amazing.
And also, I disagree with the listener's view that the Angels' method of disposing of people doesn't make sense. I think that was something that somebody said. Whereas
parasites.
It's one of the things. No, the idea, but the idea of taking away their potential future by sending them back into the past. Potential energy is something you can feed off. It's something that we have now, but in terms of time, to take away that sort of potential future, you imagine that would create some sort of energy that they could feed off. They feed off sort of years not lived.
Within the law of the program, if you think about Name of the Doctor, when he finds his tomb, and there's that thing, that helix, which represents all of the trail that the Doctor's left by changing history. Well, the Angels are doing the same thing, so that it's creating energy by changing the timelines.
It's about potential energy, and I think it's potential logic rather than science logic. But
it's not. There isn't a science basis, but
no.
In this instance, the idea of them being a quantum being fits with that, but also the idea that they're different when you look at them and when you look away at them. But I think there are lapses of logic about, wouldn't they just turn the lights off, or wouldn't it go dark eventually when they're all looking at one another? But that's the kind of poetic thing at the end.
But I think the point that he was making, Andy Mousey, is the same as the one you're making. It's such a great episode. Does it really matter if you can make it add up or not?
Yeah.
And speaking of great episodes, so okay, obviously now we've kind of laid our cards on the table and we think Blink should have won. We three, I think Blink should have won. But Human Nature, I would suggest, is probably, for me, the best story in the Russell T Davies era outside of the ones written by Stephen Moffat. So that's, incredibly high praise that it's only eclipsed in this series by one of the stories that I think is in the top 5 ever. I think Human Nature finishes on a slightly odd note. So, or a couple of slightly odd notes. So he does the bit in the TARDIS where the Doctor is deceiving the family of blood, and then he goes to the punishments that the Doctor metes out to the family of blood, which don't necessarily feel appropriate for the Doctor. But then thinking about it, this is the 10th Doctor, the David Tennant Doctor, the No Second Chances Doctor, and he's had this strange relationship with meting out punishment across the whole of the period. So maybe it's just the way this story sets it, by doing the voiceover to go with it and that kind of stuff, that feels maybe slightly inappropriate. But actually, in terms of fiction, it feels novelistic to do it in that way at the end of this. And actually, I really like the way it's done. And then you move on and you've got the Saving Private Ryan bit at the end, where you get the flash forward to the future and how this story has affected the lives of somebody, of one of the characters in it. And that's very unusual for Doctor Who too. So it feels like it finishes in unusual ways, but I like the fact that it finishes in unusual ways, because I think one of the things about Doctor Who is, it's been running now in the modern series for like 17 years or whatever it is. I like the ones that do it differently. So Blink does it even more differently than this, but I think the way this does things differently is exceptional too. And the only thing about this that I really don't think very much of is the fact that they called the antagonists in the story the family of blood, because I think that sounds like a ridiculous name that doesn't really make any sense, and I can't see where in the fiction it would have come from. It sounds very much like something that was imposed on it by the author, and I wonder if that's a Russell T Davies invention, because I don't think it's called the family of blood in the book. So that feels like an RTD imposition that sits at odds with the Paul Cornell-ness of the rest of the story. But the rest of the story is astonishing, and tell you what, Father's Day looked like that would probably be the best thing Paul Cornell ever wrote for Doctor Who on the screen. And he only wrote one more story, and he writes a story that makes Father's Day look a bit insignificant and not very muchness, really. So Human Nature's fantastic. And second to Blink in my eye, but that's still a very, very high bar that it gets very close to vaulting over. That's Human Nature.
Obertides, they were called in the book. which I reread recently. But I think they were in a family once they adopted human form.
It's the family of blood that is, because of blood and family both means the same thing. So it's like why? What's the point?
So I used to have a problem with the ending, but actually thinking about it now, I think because it's narrated by Latimer, isn't it? So it's him describing things. So there's that feel that, and that the whole thing is kind of slightly unreliable, that it's all written down, it's all a story that he's remembering because it's framed by this, or it sort of ends with him sort of clearly sort of remembering these stories. So that ending where he's sort of locking people up in black holes and things, you can kind of get away with. It's almost poetic on purpose, because Latimer's sort of thinking, what's the worst thing the Doctor could do if he could go anywhere? These are the worst things. He locks somebody in a mirror where you can always see him. So it's like a human interpretation of what the Doctor might have done. And for all we know, the 10th Doctor just put them on Sharda and then went away, or something like that, or got the Jadoon involved. But I like it because it is poetic. I think you said it was novelistic, and one of the things Paul Cornell's good at, but also it gets in the way sometimes, is writing quite florid, sort of descriptive passages, which are sort of expansive and poetic, and that certainly happens here. Where he gets away with it here is the whole two stories kind of suits that kind of writing. It suits a novelistic approach. I think it's the two episodes are well structured. I think the setting's really good. I always like historical or stories set in history, because you've immediately got a sort of tailor-made, out-of-the-box texture and atmosphere there. You don't have to do anything, just put a smoke machine in and you've got it all. So that works. The performances, the female performances, are really good in this. And I like the Scarecrows as well. I think the Scarecrows are a good addition. I think it's better than the novel. I think the novel needed Scarecrows in it.
Yes, I agree.
I think if Russell T Davies had edited Paul Cornell's novel, I think it would have been a strong addition. But obviously, the key thing to the novel and this is this central concept of the Doctor losing his identity and becoming human, and that's fully explored here. And it's so strong that Russell T Davies and Stephen Moffat and Chris Chibnall, they all pick up on it and use it to varying degrees. So yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I agree about the novel. There's a bit in the middle of the novel where I think it kind of falls out of focus. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons why it doesn't have something like the Scarecrows in there to bring that focus back in. And that certainly happens on the TV. Just when you're starting to think, oh, this is not going to be very much like Doctor Who, all of a sudden it very much is. Simon, oh no, actually, before I come to you, Simon, I forgot to read out the comments for this, so I should, because they're both by people I don't think have had comments from yet. David Ewan says, the most moving and emotional Doctor Who TV story since The Curse of Fenric. Interesting that both deal with the effects of war at home. Having Tennant play John Smith might be a taste of how he would have perhaps played the Doctor in the classic series. Sublime and out of this world, he says, voting it first. And David Kitchen also votes it first. He says, it remains my favourite story of all of New Who. It blends time travel, character, history, scary aliens, good locations, and a brilliant guest cast as a perfect example of Doctor Who. And I think the only thing that maybe sets apart from that is because the Doctor isn't the Doctor throughout most of it. But then you throw light on something by doing it from a new angle, right? So, the best way to do Doctor Who, occasionally, not all the time, is by not being Doctor Who and looking at how Doctor Who works by not being Doctor Who, which again is why I think Blink works really well. Simon, what do you think?
Jessica Hines is amazing.
Yes, of course.
Of course.
And a woman. Who'd have thunk it?
They're doing really well for themselves, the women, aren't they?
I know, yeah. Considering at the start of the episode, I was worried about how I was going to come across. But anyway, yeah, it's really great. Do you know what? I really, really like the vengeful Doctor at the end of the episode. And as Matt says, yes, is that, do we see the how Sangster. No, sorry, Thomas Sangster. Timothy Latimer. Sorry, there I am looking at Wikipedia, giving the secrets away. How he interprets what they do to the or what he does to the, because in theory, how would he know? How would he know what the Doctor does with these creatures after he leaves?
Should he?
But I like it because it, whether it's a happy accident or not, it fits in with the trajectory towards the Time Lord Victorious. We're talking 1,000-year-old being who's been through the Time War, is still getting over it, make no bones about it, and has just had to kill his human self and break the heart of the woman he loved. And these creatures have made him do that and have pushed him into a corner where he had to behave in this way. And this is the emotional bounce back from that. So I think poetically or emotionally, I think it works. And it's only in hindsight we turn around. But in the same way, you know, we can turn around to any classic era story where the Doctor uses a gun and say, well, I don't think the Doctor would do that. This is no different. This is no different. And maybe he would do something like that because we don't know the crimes of these creatures either. So within the confines of that story, I think it works. So yeah, it's really great, and it's only Blink's perfection, I think, that puts, you know, it's that same old thing. If these two stories hadn't been in the same series, then there's no question that Human Nature would have been up there as number one.
Yeah, absolutely true. So, conclusion, I think we both see, all three of us rather, seem to have enjoyed all of the stories.
Yeah,
I think, you know, for you, Simon, I think this is eclipsed by series 4 because of Catherine Tate, right?
yeah. I mean, going back to that first story, Smith and Jones, you know, essentially that whole thing is kind of repeated for Partners in Crime, but it's Catherine Tate that lifts it above the other one for me.
I think for me, I also began to notice, well, he's just doing the formula again in terms of how the series was put together. And this becomes very noticeable with series 4 when it's the same format yet again. And I started to yearn for something a bit different. And of course we got it. So then, you know, no problem. By series 6, it was starting to be different. And I think maybe that formula outstayed its welcome, but I don't think by too much. And I don't think, given that he's using that formula, I don't think you can lay the complaint at the series that has that formula imposed upon it. I think series 3 is Russell T Davies, not at his absolute pinnacle, but it's certainly not far off it. And it's only some of those structural things I talked about earlier. Matt, so overall, your impression of this series?
It's better than I remembered when we started talking about it for the today. I think I'm not a massive fan of Catherine Tate. So I think a lot of this is saved by not having Catherine Tate in it, rather than the flip side. But having said that, last time I saw episodes from series 4, she sort of grew on me a bit more. So I probably just need to watch more of her. Maybe I will. But yeah, it is that kind of 5 episodes series that I still remember watching, where you just think, well, there's 2 episodes in a row they've done really well. Oh my god, there's 3 episodes in a row that are all top 10 Doctor Who, and it just keeps on coming, and they don't really drop the ball, so that by the time that final episode comes, I kind of ignored the shortcomings because I just thought, no, I'm still going to believe that this is the greatest Doctor Who has ever been. So it is a fantastic run of stories.
Simon, final thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'm down on the series because I always remember the unrequited love thread that was running through it. And you know, as I've said before, I don't necessarily enjoy Freema Agyeman's performance for a lot of it, but yeah, on analysis, it really isn't that bad. I don't think I've ever thought it was bad, and I think a lot of the episodes that people in general think are really bad, like Last of the Time Lords, I don't really have a problem with. And I think I've got more of an issue with some of the episodes like Shakespeare Code being slightly dull in places. I have more of an issue with than them actually being bad. I mean, we are talking the Doctor Who's Imperial phase here, where it had 3 programs on at once, and so it really wasn't doing badly, was it?
No, it wasn't. Right, next week, because we're going to get through these 4 polls in 4 weeks straight. Well, unless all things being equal. Next week we'll be back to talk about the trial of a Time Lord. That'll be interesting. Until then, I was JR.
I was Matt.
And I was Simon.
And we will speak again soon.